Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for hanging in there. It's been a long day, but hopefully we can cap it all off with an interesting presentation. And I hope you'll come away with a little better understanding of the Department of Energy's Loan Guarantee Program. Hi, my name is Edward Davis. I've been with the DOE Loan Program as a consultant contractor for over 15 years. I've been involved in a variety of the clean tech sectors, including biofuels, offshore wind, hydrogen, advanced nuclear, and others. So sort of a jack of all trades, if you will, master of none. Background is in engineering, business development, and government affairs. So with that, we'll go on to the next slide. So again, we're here to talk about deploy, and lifting off innovative technologies. But first, I see Brian Mahar, who is the director of the LPO Public Affairs Program, is here to join us. Good afternoon, Brian. And I could welcome you up, and you can take a chair, and you can. Okay, thanks. So our mission statement is here on the right. And again, the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office is unlike every other office within the Department of Energy that typically works with the private sector through a grant. We're a loan program. We're not a grant program. And our mission, we work with the private sector to finance and deploy, to scale up innovative technologies, and to build energy infrastructure and domestic supply chains, create jobs, and reduce emissions in communities around the country. That's our mission. We are, as our director is always fond of saying, we are private sector-led, government-enabled. Private sector-led, government-enabled. And here's a quote from Jigar Shah. He says, there are many areas here where we're talking about technology, that technology might be mature, but it's not mature from a standpoint of access to capital. And that's what we're here to provide, is access to capital. So this is a bridge to bankability. This is sort of one of our standard slides that we use. And if you will, this is a bridge. Obviously, it's a metaphor. Down here, it's rocky. It's hazardous, it's dangerous. We call it the valley of death. This is where innovative technologies that don't get loan guarantees go to, that's where they end up. So we're here to provide qualified, eligible projects to assist them to cross that valley of death, first-of-a-kind deployments, and to reach the full acceptance of the marketplace. That's really a shorthand version of what the mission of the Loan Programs Office is all about. Full market acceptance. So here's a snapshot of our latest activity report from August. We're involved in about over a dozen clean tech vertical sectors, from renewable energy, advanced nuclear, biofuels, advanced vehicles and manufacturing, virtual power plants, transmission, storage, hydrogen, advanced fossil, critical materials. And, you know, 2 or 3 years ago when we started, we barely had a pipeline of projects. And now we're less than 3 years, we have about $144 billion worth of project applications in our pipeline. That's really significant. And we're averaging about 2 applications for every week. So, you know, by the end of the year, this is August, you know, we'll be sort of north of $150 billion. That's very significant. We started almost from scratch after being dormant for a 3 or 4 year period prior to administration coming in, the new administration coming in. So what is our value proposition? Well, number one is to provide patient capital to qualified, innovative projects. We provide flexible financing terms. Up to 80% of the total project cost we can lend over very long tenors, up to 30 years or 90% of the life of the capital assets. And we are a committed DOE partnership. We don't sell off our loans. We're there from beginning of the loan to the end of the project, all the way through. Department of Energy has over, as most of you know in the room, over 10,000 engineers and scientists and 17 national laboratories. There's not a technical issue that we aren't able to resolve working with the applicants. A lot of our first-of-a-kind projects, they start off and they eventually, inevitably, will run into some technical difficulties. And that's where partnering with the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office really offers an edge to our applicants. I'm going to focus on what we call our clean energy program, but I wanted to point out and share with you, we have other programs as well. This was the original program that's called the Innovative Energy Program that was started under the 2005 Energy Policy Act. The Congress recognized back in 2005 that Department of Energy has done a fairly good job over the years in basic sciences, development of technologies, all the way through demonstration. But when it came time for those first commercial deployments, quite often private sector capital wasn't available, or if it was available, it was very expensive. So the Congress basically, in its infinite wisdom, established the Loan Programs Office. Again, it's the unique office. It's the only one that offers loans versus grants to help and assist the private sector projects to commercialize. So I'm not really fond of this slide because it's sort of up and down. It's not, linear. I'll have to ask Brian about that. He can straighten it out one day. But this is sort of a timeline, if you will. Our program, once an applicant sort of comes in contact and submits an application, it takes about, I would say, roughly give or take a year. Much of that time is really controlled by the applicant. A shovel-ready, what we call a shovel-ready project that has all of the tickets, if you will, can move rather rapidly through our system. So a lot of the timeline is really in control of the applicant. For innovative projects, we have a two-step application process. And by the way, there's no application fees. Originally, we had application fees, but beginning with the new administration, those fees were eliminated altogether. So there's no application fees whatsoever with respect to the Loan Programs Office. But so end to end, it takes about a year. We begin with what we call a Part 1 eligibility review. We have 4 eligibility criteria. Let me explain. The first eligibility criteria is the project has to incorporate innovative technology. By innovative technology, there's a 2-part test. One is a classical test. It has to be newly invented, discovered, designed, or it's a project that results in an improvement, a significant improvement in productivity or value. It could be one or the other, or a combination of both. That qualifies as an innovative technology under our program. The second, and this is really the sort of the heart and soul of the program, the project's implementation has to result in a meaningful reduction in greenhouse gases. It's very important. Meaningful reduction in greenhouse gases. Third, all of our projects have to be located in the United States. Now, for a manufacturing project, you can export the product from the manufacturing plant. That doesn't, the manufacturing plant still meets the eligibility criteria being located in the United States. So, and the fourth, and very important, because we're a loan program, there needs to be a reasonable prospect of repayment. Very important, very, very significant. So we go through, we're here, we're number 2. So two-part process, 2 applications. First is sort of the technical review, looking at the innovative aspect of the application, the technology, and doing a life cycle greenhouse gas analysis to determine whether or not the project, if indeed implemented as proposed, will result in a reduction in greenhouse gases. And if it does, the project is invited into submitting a Part 2. The Part 2 is really focused on the financial viability. We'll ask for the submittal of a financing plan, a business plan, a financial model, a sort of a investment grade rating for the project. And once all those things in, we'll start a due diligence process. If the project is deemed to be completed, we'll initiate a due diligence process where we begin to evaluate significant details of the project with an eye to developing a term sheet. And so we'll work with the applicant to develop that term sheet, and at the end of the due diligence process, reach an agreement with the applicant. We'll enter into what's called a conditional commitment. Conditional commitment will have a term sheet that includes the terms and conditions that govern the loan, and then from there we go into close and fund. And then, importantly, the last step is monitoring. Again, the LPO program does not sell off its loans. We're there as a partner supporting the applicant through the life of the project. Here, this is, again, I want to emphasize these views that I'm providing here this afternoon, they are my own. This is sort of a standard disclaimer. I'm a consultant, contractor to the Department of Energy. This slide here is sort of a view from the trenches, and I just wanted to identify some of the reasons that might trip up potential applicants along the way. And maybe during the Q&A session, we can talk about those. But number one on top of this list here, I had 10, but I had to add 11 because they're all very important. Concept project versus an actual defined project that can be project financed. Obviously, cocktail napkins don't count. You have to have enough detail to allow the LPO professional staff to evaluate the project. And again, there's two steps. You can have the first step in terms of the technical review, focused on the technical part, but when you have the second step, which is on financial viability, you really have to have some of that early preliminary engineering completed in order to inform some of the contracts. We're talking about feedstock contracts, we're talking about EPC contracts, we're talking about offtake contracts. A constellation of those contracts need to have some basis in fact, and that's informed by the underlying engineering. Very important. Number 3, projects have to have a demonstration. We do not fund demonstrations or pilot projects. So initially, we're looking for about 2,000 hours, typically 1/4 of the year. 2,000 hours of successful demonstration of the technology in terms of proving out its technical viability. In terms of the technical readiness scale, for those of you familiar with the DOE's technical readiness levels, we're operating at about a 7 or 8, about that range. This, again, the LCA life cycle analysis of the greenhouse gas, exceedingly important. We'll ask the applicant to send us the information, the emissions data, if you will. We send that off to the National Engineering Technical Laboratory in West Virginia. They do the life cycle analysis, and there has to be a meaningful reduction from what we call the business as usual case. So that's extremely important. 5, 6, and 7 are all sort of related. It's very important to have equity sponsors. The maximum that we will leverage our loans is we need a minimum of 20% equity, private sector equity, minimum, against 80% debt. And that really is the maximum statutorily under law that we can offer. Actual underwritings are considerably less than 80%. So getting equity sponsors is really important. Why? Because you need development funding. it's almost impossible to develop a project to meet the requirements of private sector banking or Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office without having sufficient project development funding to do some of the engineering studies and some of the other things that are required by the program. FOTS 5, 6, and 7. You need a defined site. Site control is very important. You need to know where you're going to locate your project in the United States. It has to be in the United States. That's one of the 4 eligibility criteria. Has to be in the United States. And you really do need, by the time you submit a Part 2 application, you have to have nailed down your site. You can have alternative sites during the Part 1, but by the time you get into due diligence is on the site. So we'll have an environmental team at the Department of Energy that is experienced in doing environmental assessments on the site. I already talked about the early engineering, how important that is. There needs to be a showing that the project has in hand or will have in hand all of the necessary regulatory approvals, state, local, federal. That's very important. Let me just speak to this federal support restriction. So you put that in the vernacular, we refer to that as the double dipping rule. When it comes to showing that there's a reasonable prospect of repayment, the applicant cannot depend either directly or indirectly on other sources of federal funds. You might look at me quizzically, what does that mean, what I just told you? Well, it means that if you're getting a grant money from the Department of Energy, you can't use the grant money to pay back the DOE loan. So those two have to be separate. That's called the federal support restriction. And that's why a lot of the hydrogen hub projects really haven't been over to the Loan Programs Office requesting loans, because a lot of them are still waiting to find out whether or not they've been selected for a grant for the hydrogen hubs. So the two have to be separated, either in space by dividing up the scope, breaking the scopes up, and one scope could be grant, one scope could be a loan, or by in time they could be separated. That is, they can receive and exhaust the funding through grants, and after all the grants have been exhausted, they can begin receiving loan funding. But they have to remain separate. That's a really important restriction, and it was reinforced in the recently enacted Inflation Reduction Act. And then reasonable prospect of repayment, what does that depend on? We do most of our funding, although we do corporate balance sheet funding, where we look to the corporate balance sheet as the ultimate, if you will, assurance of payback. I mean, you would have to actually go and use the balance sheet. But most of our financing is what's called non-recourse project financed. What's non-recourse project financed, you might ask? Well, that is, it's based on the projection of cash flows. The lender, in this case DOE, does not have the right to go back to the sponsor who provided equity and say, hey, the project, is in the ditch. It needs a couple more hundreds of millions, tens of millions of dollars. The parent doesn't have an obligation. What is really the assurance, the security of the loan, is backed up on the future generation of cash flows. And that's what the due diligence is really focused on. Is this project going to generate an adequate amount of cash flows year to year over the life of the loan to repay the loan? That's what all that's about. So we do project finance, what's called non-recourse project financing. And we look for reasonable payment. Where do you look for reasonable payment? Well, who is taking the service, the product from the project, right? So you have to call what we call, quote unquote, the glorious off-takers. There's got to be, who's the lucky Pierre? Who is taking this product from this project? Who is going to sign a credit-worthy off-taker. Who's going to sign up for a 10, 15, 20-year off-take agreement to take all of that product coming out of that project in order to guarantee the cash flow over the many years of the lifetime of the loan in order to assure the repayment of the loan? That's a reasonable prospect of repayment, and that's the off-take. So again, here, from the trenches, early on, we get, after the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act passed and the the IRA passed, we saw a lot of potential applicants, what we call pre-revenue. Pre-revenue, they're not generating any revenue. Startups, they had no capital for project development. And that was it's a huge handicap, as I've already explained. And they were hoping to bootstrap the startup and development of the project with loan proceeds. We can't do that. Can't loan to companies that don't produce any revenue. So that's a non-starter. Also, there was a lack of experience, no project development, no project finance track record, et cetera, no offtake. So for us, at least in the early days, seems as though it appeared to us that the hydrogen sector looks like the majors, Linde, Air Products, and others, were not jumping into the market right away. You had a lot of, startup companies jumping in, but it appeared to us that there was a really significant shortage of experienced project developers with quality projects. And that was true, at the very beginning. That's less true today than it was maybe about a year ago. Another sort of view from the trenches, we talk a lot about the hype, the hydrogen hype. Well, there's such a thing called, we had sort of waves of hype, if you will. We had the passage of the IRA and all those tax credits that everyone's talking about. We're still waiting for the Treasury Department, the IRS, to promulgate its guidance on the 45V hydrogen tax credits. We had all that publicity over the hydrogen hubs. Mind you, there's only 8 of them, $8 billion, 6. So just average it out, $1 billion per hub. Most of these hubs, I would say, are regional. They are expansive. I mean, their distances are like hundreds of miles. That's a lot of infrastructure. And for $1 billion, I don't know, it doesn't quite cover it all. And they have to be diversified geographically. Feedstock-wise, they have to be diversified. Got to have one sort of hydrocarbons, I guess, and one is green energy, and one is nuclear energy. So you're diversifying, you're spreading that all out. So we think, the Loan Programs Office thinks that after the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration makes its initial selections and announces them publicly, that we'll see a lot of people coming back to us, ones that either weren't selected or other sort of projects that sort of break up and are more, rather than regional projects, big scale regional projects, I would call them bite-sized project financeable projects. So the hype cycle, evidently this hype cycle is a term that's trademarked by the Gartner Consulting Group. And I looked it up, Wikipedia, and look it up. So it comes with the initial technology, and then it just climbs very rapidly to a peak. And the peak occurs, we're right about the peak right now. I think after the hubs are selected and the 45V is announced, we're going to be at the top of the peak. And then it plummets, right? That's the Gardner hype cycle, and he trademarked it. Very successful con. But our point here is the hype cycle does nothing to improve the quality of project developers or the quality. So you can hype it all you want, but at the end of the day, you've got to have quality project developers developing quality projects. So experienced developers typically engaged, and we're seeing more and more. We're seeing more what I call majors, the ones that have been on the sideline, taking a look at how this whole marketplace, this landscape, is going to shape up. There's some of them are still waiting on the sidelines for 45V. But we've seen some moves. For example, those of you who might recognize Chevron, that's a big company, right? They just purchased in Utah the controlling interest in the ACES project, which the Department of Energy provided a big loan guarantee to develop green hydrogen storage in a salt cavern in Utah to use the hydrogen later on to generate clean electricity. So at the end of the day, height doesn't help, but it does create a glut of non-viable projects, and we've seen a wave of those. Hopefully, those are behind us now. We do have a very robust, I want to say, we do have a very robust pipeline, and we are open for business for more. I brought some specially designed hydrogen postcards for each of you here. You can pick them up after we're over here, but you can pick them up. You can send Brian a card and put your name in here, and we'll be responding to you, okay? So that's about it. I guess one more slide. Very important. Here's our contact information. You can contact me. I'll be around afterwards. Brian will be around afterwards. We're here to answer your questions. Again, we're open for business. If you have a project, if you know someone who has a project, please reach out to us and contact us.